The spiral fate part. I ghost from the past. The wind howled across Black Hollow as dust danced in the air like ghosts with unfinished business. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the auction yard, where men and women in worn denim and weathered boots gathered their faces creased with the stories of hard living in this forgotten corner of Montana. This was horse country, where a man's word still meant something, where folks judged character by calloused hands and unflinching eyes, and where the past had a way of refusing to stay buried. Jackson Sutton stood frozen behind the corral fence, his weathered hands gripping the wood so hard his knuckles went white. The scar across his chin pulsed with each labored breath he took. At 65, Jackson was a living legend in these parts. Or at least he had been before the incident 11 years ago that had cost him his reputation, his family, and very nearly his sanity. "Can't be," he whispered, the words carried away by the wind. But it was. There at the end of the trailer ramp stood a horse that shouldn't exist. Midnight, or something that looked exactly like him, with the same twisted scar on his flank, and those burning, unblinking eyes that had once made grown men step back. 11 years ago, Jackson had buried that horse with his own hands. Or at least, that's what he thought. The animal had fallen off Hollow Ridge during a storm so violent the thunder felt like judgment itself. And now here he was, back from the dead, with that unmistakable spiral scar still visible beneath his ebony coat. "In all my years," came a low voice beside him, Sheriff Mason Kingsley, 60 years old with a military straight posture and eyes that missed nothing, stood watching the commotion around the mysterious horse. "Never seen anything like this. You sure that's him, Jackson, after all this time?" Jackson didn't answer. He couldn't. The sight of midnight had collapsed time, bringing him back to that terrible night on the ridge, the night when everything changed, the night when the storm spoke and the earth swallowed secrets whole. From across the yard, Dr. Sarah Collins narrowed her eyes. At 50, she was the new veterinarian in town, having moved to Black Hollow just 6 months prior. She'd examined hundreds of wild horses in her career, but nothing about this one sat right. His muscles trembled, not with fear, but as if holding memories. His breath was shallow. Every movement was restrained, calculated, almost human. "That's not adrenaline," she muttered, moving closer to the pen. "That's memory." The crowd had fallen silent, an unnatural hush for an auction yard. No one spoke. No one moved. All eyes were on the midnight black stallion that stood unnaturally still, his gaze fixed on Jackson Sutton as if nothing else existed. Up on the auction platform, Howard Bray leaned into the microphone, ready to spin the moment into profit. "Well now," he said, with a practiced grin that didn't reach his eyes, "looks like we got ourselves a legend walking on 4 legs." But his daughter Hannah Bray didn't share her father's enthusiasm. At 35, she had inherited her mother's intuition rather than her father's business sense. She was staring into Midnight's eyes like she saw something the others didn't. Later, she'd tell Sarah, "He's not just back, he's warning us." "Where'd this animal come from?" Sheriff Kingsley demanded, addressing Howard. Before the auctioneer could answer, a figure emerged from the edge of the crowd. Dressed in black denim and dust, the stranger moved with quiet purpose. Grant Valentine appeared without fanfare, holding a single envelope under one arm. Ownership papers. "He came with me," Valentine said simply. His voice as dry as autumn leaves. He remembers. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Valentine looked to be in his mid-50s, but something about his eyes suggested a man who had seen far more years than his appearance betrayed. His face was handsome in a severe way, unmarked by the sun, despite the outdoor life evident in his posture. "And who might you be?" Sheriff Kingsley stepped forward, hand resting casually near his hip, an old habit from younger days. "Grant Valentine." The man offered the envelope without further explanation. "Everything's in order. Registered under my name." Sarah moved closer to the horse, professional curiosity overriding caution. Midnight's ears twitched as she approached, but he didn't shy away. When she reached toward him, Sheriff Kingsley called out a warning, but she ignored it, placing her hand gently on the horse's neck. What happened next silenced even the whispers. Midnight turned to face her fully, his eyes locking with hers. And in those eyes, Sarah saw something impossible. Recognition, understanding, and beneath it all, a terrible knowledge no animal should possess. The horse's breathing quickened, his nostrils flaring. Then, without warning, he reared back, powerful hooves slashing the air inches from Sarah's face. She stumbled backward, falling hard as Midnight came down with a thundering impact that shook the ground. "Get back!" Jackson shouted, vaulting the fence with surprising agility for his age. He placed himself between Sarah and the horse, his movement slow and deliberate. "Easy now," he murmured, not to the horse, but seemingly to something inside it. "Easy." Midnight immediately calmed, lowering his head toward Jackson, nostrils flaring. Something passed between man and horse, a current of understanding that made the hairs on Sarah's arms stand on end. "That's not natural," someone whispered from the crowd. "That's not adrenaline making him act that way," Sarah said as she got to her feet, brushing dust from her jeans. "It's recognition. That horse knows Jackson. It remembers him." Valentine watched the interaction without surprise. "Memory," he said quietly, "is a burden that crosses species." Sheriff Kingsley examined the ownership papers. They appeared legitimate, state-sealed, and properly filed. But something about the too-perfect documentation made his law enforcement instincts twitch. "I'd like to know exactly where this horse came from, Mr. Valentine, considering it bears a striking resemblance to an animal that supposedly died over a decade ago." Valentine's expression remained impassive. "Some things refuse to stay buried, Sheriff, especially things that have unfinished business." The auction proceeded with an unnatural tension hovering in the air. When Midnight's lot number was called, not a single paddle rose. No one dared bid. Howard Bray tried to generate interest, but the crowd remained stubbornly silent, many avoiding even looking directly at the horse. "No bids." Howard's voice cracked with frustration. "This is a fine specimen, folks." "That horse isn't meant to be sold," Valentine stated flatly. "He's not here for that." "Then why bring him to an auction?" Howard demanded. Valentine's gaze swept across the gathered faces before settling on Jackson. "To find what he's looking for." As the crowd dispersed, muttering about curses and ghosts, Jackson remained planted near the pen, unable to look away from Midnight. The horse hadn't stopped staring at him either. His flank rose and fell slowly, his breath labored but steady, and there, plain as day, was the spiral-shaped scar. Not just any mark, but a precise pattern that Jackson remembered seeing right before the horse vanished off that ridge 11 years ago. It hadn't faded. It had deepened the whorls, more pronounced, more deliberate. "Jackson," said Sarah, stepping cautiously beside him. Her voice was low, professional. "That scar. Horses don't scar like that unless it's deep tissue trauma. That doesn't happen from falling. It looks more like branding." Jackson finished, his voice hollow. "I know." Sarah studied his face. "You buried this horse. You're certain?" Jackson didn't respond immediately. His jaw clenched, his eyes distant. He wasn't looking at the horse anymore, but staring into a memory that had haunted him for over a decade. "That night, 11 years ago," he finally said, his voice barely audible above the wind. "The storm was unnatural. Lightning struck the same tree twice. The air smelled like metal. Midnight bolted, panicked beyond control, and I chased him toward the ridge." He paused, the scar on his chin whitening as he clenched his jaw. "But the part I never told anyone, not even Emma, my daughter, was what happened when we reached the top." Sarah waited, giving him space to continue. Midnight had stopped, just stopped, turned back, and looked at me with something more than fear. There was knowing in his eyes. Then the ground gave way. Jackson swallowed hard. I searched for 3 days, found his body at the bottom. At least I thought it was his body. I buried him myself near Black Hollow Ridge. Sheriff Kingsley approached his boots, kicking up dust. "You said this horse was dead," he said flatly. Jackson didn't turn. "He was. I buried him near Black Hollow Ridge. You sure it wasn't someone else's horse one that just looks like him?" Jackson shot him a glare sharp enough to cut steel. "I raised that horse from a colt. I could pick him out of a herd with my eyes closed." From behind the stables, Grant Valentine was watching. He hadn't left since the auction ended. He hadn't said a word since he presented the papers. Sarah noticed him now, the way his hand rested on the pocket where the documents were, like he was guarding something more than ownership. And when midnight shifted, suddenly turning his head toward Valentine, Sarah saw it again. Recognition. Not fear, not submission, but a silent communication that transcended normal animal behavior. "I think we buried the wrong truth, Sheriff." Jackson's voice was hoarse, heavy with implication. "And whatever this horse went through, it wasn't nature. Somebody brought him back, and they didn't bring him back whole." No one replied. The only sound was Midnight's slow, shaking breath, as if he too remembered everything. The sun had begun its descent behind the mountains when Sarah finally returned to her clinic. The events at the auction yard had left her with more questions than answers, and professional curiosity wouldn't let her walk away. As a veterinarian with a specialization in equine behavior, she'd seen animals respond to trauma in countless ways, but never like this. She pulled Midnight's ownership documents from her bag, copies Sheriff Kingsley had grudgingly allowed her to make. The paperwork was pristine, every detail in order dating back 3 years to when Valentine supposedly acquired the horse from a private seller in Wyoming, but the documents felt too perfect, too convenient. The spiral scar haunted her thoughts. In her 25 years of veterinary practice, she'd never seen a marking quite like it, deliberate yet ancient-looking, like a symbol from some forgotten language. Not a brand for ownership, but something else entirely. As darkness fell across Black Hollow, Jackson Sutton sat alone in the kitchen of his ranch house, a cup of coffee gone cold in his hands. Photographs lined the walls, faded memories of better days. There he was younger and smiling, standing next to Midnight after winning the county rodeo championship. And there in the corner of another photo, barely visible, stood Robert Barnes, his former ranch hand and friend, the same friend who had disappeared the night Midnight supposedly died. No one had ever connected the two events. When Robert didn't show up for work the next day, folks assumed he'd simply moved on, as drifters often did. Only Jackson knew different. Only Jackson had seen the look in Robert's eyes when they'd reached the ridge that night. Only Jackson had heard his last words. "There's something down there, Jack. Something old." The knock on the screen door came just after midnight. Jackson sat at the kitchen table, another cup of coffee gone cold in his hand. He didn't flinch at the sound. Somehow, he already knew who it was. When he opened the door, the porch light flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the dust. Emma Sutton stood there, a duffel bag slung over one shoulder, her hair tied back, and her face harder than he remembered. "Don't say a word," she muttered, brushing past him. "I'm not here for you. I'm here for the horse." They hadn't spoken in nearly 7 years. Not since the last fight, the one where she'd accused him of caring more about animals than people. Now she stood in his kitchen like she'd never left, examining the half-burnt photos still pinned to the wall, most of them featuring Midnight. "So it's true," she said. "It's him." Jackson nodded slowly. "He's not the same," he replied, "but it's him." Emma dropped her bag on the floor with a heavy thud. At 35, she had grown into a woman with her father's stubbornness and her late mother's keen intellect. Her work as an animal behavior specialist had taken her far from Black Hollow, but the news of Midnight's impossible return had drawn her back like a magnet. "I thought you were crazy when you called," she admitted. "But when I saw the footage online, that walk, that twitch in his left ear, it's like muscle memory. That's not something you can fake." Her voice cracked for a second, and she swallowed it down fast. "I trained him with you, remember, before everything went to hell." Jackson watched his daughter, noting the changes time had wrought, the lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, the wary set to her shoulders, the way she kept her distance, both physically and emotionally. "How did you get here so fast?" he asked. "You were in Colorado." "I drove straight through." Emma moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. "Where is he now?" "Valentine took him, said he had proper accommodations." Emma turned sharply. "And you let him?" "The papers checked out, Emma. There was nothing legal I could do." Jackson ran a hand over his face. "Sheriff's keeping an eye on things." "Sheriff Kingsley couldn't find his ass with both hands in a map," Emma snapped. "Valentine shows up out of nowhere with a horse that's been dead for 11 years, and everyone just accepts it." Jackson didn't answer. The truth was, he hadn't fought harder because part of him was afraid. Afraid of what Midnight's return meant. Afraid of the memories it dragged back to the surface. Afraid of the questions it would inevitably raise about that night on the ridge. Across town in the dark back room of the Bray auction house, Howard sat with Sheriff Kingsley. The lawman had brought Valentine's ownership papers, spreading them across the desk. "They're real," Sheriff confirmed reluctantly. "State sealed. Registered under Valentine's name for the past 3 years. Howard snorted, pouring himself another finger of whiskey. "That man walks in out of nowhere with the most famous dead horse this county's ever seen, and we're just supposed to accept that." The sheriff leaned back in his chair, running a thumb along his badge. "No," he said slowly. "But we also can't ignore it. Something's not right here, Howard. You saw how that animal looked at Sutton. That wasn't normal." Howard drained his glass. "Nothing about Jackson Sutton has been normal since that night on the ridge. First the horse dies, then Robert Barnes disappears, and Sutton turns into a goddamn hermit. Now the horse is back, and some stranger owns him. There's more to this story." Sheriff Kingsley nodded. "That's what I aim to find out." Meanwhile, at the small motel on the edge of town, Grant Valentine stood by the window of his room, watching the moon rise over the distant ridge. In his hand, he held a small medallion silver, tarnished with age, bearing the initials R.B. He spoke softly, as if to someone only he could see. "It's begun." The horse remembered the way back, just as you said he would. The next morning dawned clear and cool, the storm clouds of the previous day having moved on. Sarah arrived early at her clinic, surprised to find Emma Sutton waiting on the porch, 2 cups of coffee in hand. "Thought you might want this," Emma said, offering one of the cups. "I hear you've been asking questions about Midnight." Sarah accepted the coffee with a nod of thanks. "Professional curiosity. That's a remarkable animal." "More than you know." Emma followed Sarah inside the clinic. "I need your help. I want to examine him." Sarah raised an eyebrow. Valentine might have something to say about that. "Let me worry about Valentine. What I need is your professional opinion on that scar. It's not from a fall, is it?" Sarah hesitated, then shook her head. "No. It's too precise. Too deliberate. It looks almost surgical." Emma's expression darkened. "That's what I was afraid of." Dad would never have done that to him. Someone else had Midnight these past 11 years. Someone who did something to him. "The question is what?" Sarah pulled out her notes. "And why bring him back now?" Before Emma could respond, the clinic door opened, and Sheriff Kingsley stepped inside. His expression was grim. "Ladies?" He nodded in greeting. "Emma, didn't know you were back in town." "Just arrived," she replied coolly. "Something wrong, Sheriff. Maybe." He glanced between them. "I've been doing some digging on our friend, Mr. Valentine. Man doesn't seem to exist before 3 years ago. No records, no history I can find." Sarah frowned. "That's impossible in this day and age." "You'd think so." The sheriff rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "I'm headed out to the old Wilson place. Valentine's renting a cabin there. Thought you might want to come along, Dr. Collins, in case we need a professional opinion on the horse's condition." Emma stepped forward. "I'm coming too." Sheriff Kingsley looked like he might object, then thought better of it. "Your father know you're involving yourself in this." "My father's the reason I'm involving myself," Emma replied sharply. The Wilson property sat on the eastern edge of Black Hollow, a sprawling ranch that had fallen into disrepair after old Martha Wilson's husband died. The widow still lived in the main house, renting out the caretaker's cabin to make ends meet. It was this cabin, nestled against the tree line, where Valentine had taken up residence with Midnight. As they approached, Sarah noticed the horse in a small paddock standing unnaturally still, his gaze fixed on the distant ridge as if waiting for something. Valentine emerged from the cabin before they'd even stopped their vehicles. "Sheriff." He nodded unsurprised. "Miss Sutton. Doctor. I've been expecting you." "Have you now?" Sheriff Kingsley's hand rested casually near his weapon, a habit born from years of experience. "Mind if we have a word about that horse of yours?" Valentine's expression remained neutral. "Not at all. But I suspect Miss Sutton isn't here for conversation. She's here for confirmation." Emma stiffened. "Confirmation of what?" "That the horse remembers." Valentine turned his gaze to her, something ancient in his eyes. "He remembers you, Emma. He remembers your father, and he remembers what happened on that ridge 11 years ago." Sheriff Kingsley stepped forward. "And what exactly did happen, Mr. Valentine?" Valentine's attention shifted to the lawman. "Ask Jackson Sutton about Robert Barnes, Sheriff. Ask him what they found that night. Ask him what the spiral means." Emma's breath caught. "Robert, what does he have to do with this?" Valentine didn't answer. Instead, he moved toward the paddock, opening the gate. "Why don't you see for yourself he's been waiting for you?" Sarah tensed, ready to intervene if the horse showed any signs of aggression. But as Emma approached, Midnight's demeanor changed completely. The animal lowered his head, a soft, nickering sound escaping his throat. His ears twitched forward, a sign of recognition and welcome that Sarah had seen countless times between horses and their longtime handlers. Emma reached out slowly, her hand trembling slightly. When her fingers made contact with Midnight's muzzle, the horse leaned into her touch, his eyes half closing in what could only be described as relief. "My God," she whispered, "it really is you." She moved closer, running her hands along his neck, checking him over with the practiced eye of someone trained in animal behavior. When she reached the spiral scar on his flank, Midnight tensed his whole body, going rigid. "Easy," Emma murmured. "Easy, boy." But the moment her fingers traced the pattern of the scar, something changed. Midnight's eyes flew open, pupils dilating to black pools. A tremor ran through his powerful frame, and he backed away sharply, nearly knocking Emma over. "What's happening?" Sheriff Kingsley demanded, moving forward. "Don't." Valentine's command froze them all in place. "Don't touch him. The scar is sensitive." Sarah watched as Midnight pawed at the ground, his breathing, labored eyes wild. This wasn't normal equine behavior, not by any stretch. This was something else entirely. "What did you do to him?" Emma demanded, rounding on Valentine. "I didn't do anything," Valentine replied evenly. "I merely found him. The question you should be asking is, what did they do to him, and why did he come back?" Sheriff Kingsley's patience had clearly reached its limit. "All right, enough games. I want straight answers, Valentine. Where did this horse come from? How did you acquire an animal that was supposedly dead for 11 years? Valentine regarded the lawman with something like pity. Some questions, Sheriff, have answers you're not prepared to hear. He turned to Emma. But she is. So is her father. They've seen it before. Emma shook her head, confusion evident in her expression. Seen what? The spiral, Valentine said simply. The doorway. What lies beneath Hollow Ridge? A heavy silence fell over the group, broken only by the sound of Midnight's agitated breathing. Sheriff Kingsley looked between Valentine and Emma, clearly trying to make sense of the cryptic exchange. I'm going to need more than riddles, Valentine, he said firmly. Valentine nodded slowly. Then, perhaps it's time you spoke with Martha Wilson. She's been keeping her own secrets about what she saw on the ridge all those years ago. As if on cue, the front door of the main house opened, and Martha Wilson emerged onto her porch. At 80, her small frame was bent with age, but her eyes remained sharp beneath a crown of silver hair. She leaned heavily on a cane as she made her way down the steps. I told you they'd come, she called to Valentine, just like I told you that horse would find its way back to Black Hollow. Sheriff Kingsley turned in surprise. Mrs. Wilson. You know something about this? Martha's weathered face creased in a smile that held no humor. I know many things people in this town would rather forget, Sheriff, including what really happened to Robert Barnes that night on the ridge. Emma stepped forward. What about Robert? He left town right after Midnight's accident. Martha's gaze settled on Emma, a mixture of sympathy and resolve in her faded blue eyes. Is that what your father told you, child? Robert Barnes never left Black Hollow. Not alive anyway. The words landed like stones, heavy and cold. Sheriff Kingsley's posture stiffened, his law enforcement instincts fully engaged now. Mrs. Wilson, if you're suggesting— I'm not suggesting anything, Martha interrupted. I'm telling you the truth that's been buried in this town for 11 years. A truth that's finally coming to light. Because that horse refused to stay dead. She pointed a gnarled finger toward the distant ridge visible on the horizon. The answer's up there. Always has been. Valentine watched the exchange with the calm detachment of someone who'd been expecting precisely this turn of events. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that seemed to press the very air around them. The horse came back for a reason, he said. Some bonds transcend death. Some secrets refuse to stay buried. Sarah looked between them all, feeling as though she'd stepped into the middle of a story whose beginning she'd missed. I don't understand. What does a horse that survived a fall have to do with a missing man? Martha's eyes found hers something like pity in their depths. Oh, honey, Midnight didn't survive that fall, and Robert wasn't missing. They were taken, changed. And now one of them has found its way back to warn us. Warn us about what? Sheriff Kingsley demanded. Martha turned her gaze back to the ridge, a shadow passing over her features. About what's waking up under there. What's been sleeping all these years, gathering strength. The thing they found that night. The thing they should have left alone. As if in response to her words, a distant rumble of thunder rolled across the valley, though the sky remained clear. Midnight reared suddenly, a sound escaping him that was unlike any horse cry Sarah had ever heard. Low, guttural, almost human in its desperation. Valentine moved to calm the animal, whispering something in its ear that made it still immediately. The display sent a chill down Sarah's spine. This was no ordinary connection between man and beast. I think, Valentine said, turning back to them, it's time you all had a conversation with Jackson Sutton about what really happened 11 years ago. About what he and Robert found in that cave beneath the ridge. About why he's been carrying the guilt all these years. Emma's face had gone pale. What cave? Dad never mentioned a cave. Martha Wilson leaned heavily on her cane, her voice dropping to little more than a whisper. Because some things are better left undisturbed, child. Some doors should remain closed. As they stood there, the wind picked up suddenly, carrying with it the scent of ozone, the metallic tang that precedes a powerful storm. But there wasn't a cloud in the sky, just that distant ridge, standing sentinel over Black Hollow, keeping its secrets locked away in stone and shadow. Sarah felt a profound unease settle over her, the rational scientific part of her mind struggling against the growing certainty that they were standing at the edge of something ancient and dangerous. Something that had reached across 11 years to pull them all together in this moment. Tonight, Valentine set his eyes on the ridge. It has to be tonight. The horse knows the way. He always has. And as if in agreement, midnight let out another of those unnatural sounds. Not quite a whinny, not quite a scream, but something caught in between. A warning, a summoning, a promise of revelations yet to come. The die was cast, the past was rising, and Black Hollow would never be the same again.